On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its unanimous decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. It ruled that the doctrine of separate but equal had no place in public education. The court recognized the devastating and detrimental effect that segregation had upon Black children and ordered that the states end segregation with all deliberate speed. In Manatee and Sarasota counties, all deliberate speed meant 15 years before schools were finally integrated. The ruling in Brown presented both opportunities and challenges to Black families. White schools had more resources and better facilities. But Brown also meant the end to cherished relationships within Black schools. Schools were at the heart of the Black community. Parents and students placed a high value on the nurturing that occurred within the walls of those campuses. Indeed, the structures themselves were symbols of hope for equality, despite their absence of equitable resources. In the final analysis, Brown may have corrected an injustice in the law, but it did not remove racism. The first Black students entering newly integrated schools learned this lesson right away. Here are the stories of three people who went to school between 1954 and 1970. They experienced what happened between Brown and integration. I'm Renee Gilmore. Welcome to this series where the Manatee County Bar Association is having a conversation with three people who went through this. I'd like to introduce now Judge Adams. Welcome. Duran Adams, retired Circuit Court Judge, 12th Judicial Circuit. Judge Adams is a graduate of Chamberlain High School in Tampa. Next, I'd like to introduce Willie Charles Shaw, former Sarasota City Mayor and a graduate of Booker High School in Sarasota. Welcome. I'd also like to introduce Henry Lawrence of National Football League notoriety. He is a retired Oakland Raider and graduate of Florida A&M University. Mr. Lawrence attended Lincoln High School in Palmetto and graduated from the newly integrated Manatee High School. Welcome, gentlemen. I want to start off by asking you, Judge, if you would please tell us what year you graduated in and tell us a little bit about who you are, how you became impacted by this important case.
I graduated from Chamberlain High School in Tampa in 1964. So if you make the calculations, Brown was being decided in 1954, 10 years before I graduated from high school. So I was in elementary school. I was about 6 years old, I guess. I had never heard of Brown versus the Board of Education. I grew up in a family that was not privileged. I was raised by a single parent, my mom. There were four of us children in the family. She was my savior. We grew up in a tiny, tiny house. To call us middle class would be embellishing. We were, I would say, lower middle class, but we had two things going for us at that time. We had a mother who was fierce, and my mother was going to make sure that we took advantage of every possible opportunity that we had in order to do what was necessary to what we used to call back in those days succeed. As a result of her, my older sister was one of the first three females admitted to the University of Miami Medical School. She graduated from the University of Miami Medical School and was a very, very highly thought of cardiologist for, I guess, 40 years or so, and retired. You know, I didn't even have any idea of what college was. No one in my family had ever gone to college. I knew what the neighborhood was. I knew what school was, and let's talk about school for a second. Back in those days, the public school system was dynamic. The public school system was what gave kids like me the opportunity to go on to whatever we call better things. That was our route out of of poverty. And if you played by the rules and you were diligent, more often than not, it would pay off and you had a chance at what we used to call the American dream. The problem, of course, back in the 50s, now remember, what we're talking about right now, I was in about the 3rd or 4th grade, so I was not aware of what was going on. But that promise of a better life and a promise of being able to succeed through playing by the rules and getting a good public education and sticking to it and having parents that or at least a parent who would make sure that you achieved whatever that meant back in those days. As it turned out, the playing field was not equal. I didn't even know that black people lived close to me. I didn't know that black people lived close to my neighborhood. And they didn't really live that close to my neighborhood, but we lived in kind of the same quadrant of Tampa.
Judge, may I ask you, please?
Sure.
1964 is the year you were in high school?
In 1964, I graduated from high school.
You graduated from high school. Was your school, was Chamberlain integrated at that point?
Not even close. You know, honestly, it's already been mentioned that the United States Supreme Court, in order to get Brown decided, made sure that they were not going to implement the dictates of Brown right away. I mean, that was crucial to getting the Supreme Court to issue a unanimous opinion, and it was crucial that a unanimous opinion be issued in regard to this subject. So they implicated that phrase with all deliberate speed in order to make sure that they had as much time as they needed to acclimate the country to this idea of universal desegregation. Let me tell you how it was living on the other side of segregation as a young kid in Tampa. You didn't know that there were segregation laws. They were not discussed. But whatever it was that was something that was just known, and that's what happened. And so that's the kind of I guess you'd say society I grew up in. We had very few conversations in the house about that. At school, we had no conversations and no lessons about segregation, because it was still a long way off. This was something that in Tampa, Florida, seemed to be happening up north. And in fact, the truth is, the schools in, I think, Hillsborough County were not desegregated until 1970, 69 or 70, as I think that was the case in Manatee County as well. So they tried to draw it out as long as possible so that people would be less likely, I guess, to react violently. I'm not sure, but it took a long time.
Thank you for that, and we're going to come back to that.
Okay.
I'd like to introduce at this point in time former Commissioner Willie Charles Shaw, who grew up in Sarasota, graduated from Booker High School. Commissioner Shaw, if I could ask you please to tell us about your experience growing up, going to an integrated school, going to a segregated school. Start by telling us the year you graduated and what your experience was during that year.
Very much so. I graduated from the Booker High School in the class of 1965. Um, Different. Uh, we had a entrance of, I would say, integration, because we were getting job training in diversified cooperative training, DCT, and we had our first white instructor to come out and to bring diversified cooperative training to the school. We either worked in the hospitals, the restaurants, cafes downtown. So we had started to see change, but it wasn't mentioned from the Brown case of 1954. Education hadn't been there, but we were moving in a different place.
Now, Booker High School was segregated in
Totally.
1965. There were no white instructors, there were no white students.
Just the one instructor, and his response was to diversify the training, the job training, job skills, where students in 11th and 12th were offered jobs, part-time jobs after school in the hospitals or work of this site.
Talk to us a little bit, please, about your experience at Booker High School. Aside from the one instructor, it's a totally Black attended school, Black instructors, very little integration throughout the Sarasota community. You're a commissioner now. Tell us, when you compare your life today to what you faced in 1965 at that segregated school, what was happening? And you did tell us that you were not familiar with the Brown decision, but what was going on in the school? Was there talk about integration? Were you cognizant that we were moving as a society towards integrated schools?
We weren't. I wasn't. Let me just say, I wasn't as aware of change coming about at that time. Booker was still segregated. The teachers were all Black, and had been the teachers there, many for 25, 20 years or more. So I got to, I didn't have older brothers, I'm a senior. I followed my cousins and others, and it was just the norm. It was what was expected. I didn't expect to see a change or a difference at that point in time in the school system. We weren't close in activities. We had football games. Whites would come out to watch a football game, maybe, or a basketball game, to the Matchbox, and to see a game played. But interaction, we weren't there. When we were seeing integration, remember, we were seeing television, and then we were seeing dogs and integration in the evening news, and it wasn't always pretty. So
Well, let me ask you about that,
Yes,
about
please.
things not always being pretty. When you were at Booker,
Yes.
we hear about the fact that Brown brought about the fact that things like we expect to see not only integration, but an upgrade of facilities. Were you cognizant of used books being distributed to your school?
I unloaded those books and counted them for Coach Williams, the books that came from Sarasota High. I always followed somebody else, and it's funny when you mention that. Alexander Valentine brought Booker's band to our Sarasota pageant, and the first year we marched in the pageant, Booker travel behind the elephants of Ringling Brothers Circus, and our white bucks uh, didn't get changed.
You're going to have to pause for a moment and tell
Yes.
us about what white bucks are so that we don't have any confusion about white bucks are. And what's the significance of your band having to follow the Ringling Elephants?
Oh, please and thank you. Yes, definitely. White bucks are your white shoes for marching. When you Mr. Valentine, you didn't break the ranks. You didn't step out or around. You stepped through, and we had two street sweepers in, two men with 55-gallon drums. Mr. Lonnie Logan and Mr. Johnny Douglas that swept up, and they did their very best to stay in front of us, shoveling and doing so. So my introduction to integration wasn't always um, on paper. It was actually doing what had to have done. We marched through there. The next year, Booker wasn't behind. Mr. Valentine spoke up, and we had changed. Vernon Kimbrell was the superintendent of schools at that time, so we had an interaction there. But it did not change the books, the used books that we would get. Booker was built in 1953, the brick school. We were before then in wooden Quonset barracks buildings for the campus that Booker was on. When we got to Booker, Booker was not painted for 10 years. We got our first paint job in 1963 after it was built in 1953, simply because you didn't touch the walls and you didn't walk across the grass. There was not gum on the side. So we had a difference in what we saw um, with the school itself. With integration coming, it was different because we heard of it. They first two students to leave Booker to go to Sarasota High were from what is now the Rosemary district. It was the Overtown area then. That was Wilhelmina Armstrong and William Clyburn, Bill Clyburn were the first two, and they had bused. They were bused from Booker to Sarasota High part of the day, and then they came back. It was like preparing the system for our coming, pretty much.
Commissioner, thank you for that.
Yes.
I want to introduce now our resident Oakland Raider, the most famous of all of us sitting here. But thank you very much. So you graduated in 1970.
Correct.
From the school in Palmetto, Florida.
Manatee.
Manatee. Graduated from Manatee.
1 year there.
Okay. Talk to us about that, please, because there are a lot of things changing at that particular time in 1970. So we go back and say that the Brown decision was made in 1954. Here we are in 1970. You're in high school. What's happening?
I think what occurred, I think it was gradual because some of the kids from Palmetto and Bradenton elected to go to Southeast High and Palmetto High starting in the early mid-60s. Lincoln was officially closed in the summer of 1969, and we were made to go to Manatee. We didn't have a choice. Some of us, I wanted to actually go to Palmetto because quite a few kids were already there. But we didn't have a choice in the matter. And
so for a matter of just putting things in perspective, in 1969, you were in high school, right, and the school was segregated in 1969. You still are predominantly Black students?
Some Black students were going to Southeast High. Some were going to Palmetto High. but the bulk of the kids were still going to Lincoln, and they were being bused from Bradenton over to Palmetto, and sports took part of it also. I Going to integrated school was not something that I was totally unfamiliar with. Growing up as a migrant farm worker, my first school that I attended was basically in New York, Albion, New York, Albion Central. But it was not uh, a nice ordeal going to Manatee. And of course, I can relate with the books. I can remember in my mind now that the books coming from Manatee or from Palmetto, we had to use them. But the one thing that I have to say, and I know that many feel that integration was a great thing, but when I look back on it, it was twofold because I look back on it at Booker High, Manatee High. We had some stellar students coming out of Lincoln and Booker that went on to do great things. So um, it was twofold because integration was destined, and there was nothing that we are going to be able to do anything about it. But going to Manatee High, I think that it was a totally unfair situation for the black kids because there was not really any support for those kids. And the teachers basically, they didn't try to hide the things that they thought in their minds. Grade wise, I know that I was a pretty decent student, and English was my best subject, and I got a C, and I know that I was an A student. But these are the things that we had to put up with. Sports, um, kids come over, they sit on the bench. I played, and the early part of the year after the second game, I actually led a walkout. So I had to pay the price for that. But um, it's a fact that students were not being respected. They weren't being given the fair opportunity to do what they're capable of doing. In sports, we had to take the back seat. You know, I was a starter, but I was just on the field, and I decided we walked out, and that was a bad thing, you know. And um, I had to pay the price for it, and
Was that parent inspired or student inspired, the walkout?
well, parents didn't have anything to do with that. In the start, it was student. But the best was yet to come. You know, we did the walkout, and as a result, I ended up meeting with the coach and the principal. And the next week, the coach benched me, and I played no more for the rest of the year till about 2 minutes left in the game. But basketball was pretty much the same thing. You know, we had basketball, and we had some great black athletes that they were not being. Um, it was somewhat of a nightmare, but in the winter, kids decided they couldn't take anymore, so they had some big race riots. The governor even came down. They brought the National Guard down. Uh, it it got pretty nasty, and there could have been more support from, I think, from the teachers.
Can you
Uh,
describe that? Tell us what it looked like. Relive it for us so that we can see it also.
well, heads were getting knocked around, people were getting knocked down, people were getting jacked up. Um, so much so that they had to bring the National Guard in. They had dogs. It was pretty nasty. It's pretty nasty. But the kids just they couldn't take no more, and so they somewhat rebelled.
Thank you for that. I want to present this next question to Judge Adams. As we hear Mr. Lawrence talk about the fact that things got to be pretty heated, National Guard presence coming in at a point in time, were there ever any days where you felt that going to school is going to be a challenge, going to school may threaten my very existence. Going to school may be frightening for me. Any days like that?
No, and I think I know what you're getting at, and you're right. We were privileged in that way. We didn't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Um, the stuff we had to worry about was minor compared to what you're discussing. You know, um, when when Manatee, I mean when Manatee was being integrated, um, we did a movie. Charles Clapsaddle and Judge Charles Williams and I did a movie called Through the Tunnel. So we did a lot of research in regard to what was going on during that transition. And I had an African American trial clerk who worked very closely with me for almost 2 years. When I was in court, she was right here. Um, and so you'd talk about things between cases, and when she found out that we were doing this movie called Through the Tunnel, um, she she told me that she was part of that student body um, that was sent to Manatee High, and she had to walk to Manatee High School through several neighborhoods, white neighborhoods. And she said that that first year that Manatee High was integrated, these old women would come out in their yard and spray her down with water hoses as she walked by, just because she was a young black girl going to school. That happened to her. But I will tell you, there is something that creates an empathy, even though you don't have to experience it. It does create an empathy in you when you see people having to endure that through a practice of utter injustice, and you know that when you're 12 years old that this isn't right. It's not fair and it's not right. Hey, the Florida State Fair in Tampa was segregated. Everything was segregated. The stores downtown were segregated. Everything. The very first time, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, the very first time I spoke to a black person was when I went to college um, in Illinois after I graduated from high school. That first year, I went to this little college in Illinois, and of course, it was integrated. And I was talking to I remember his name to this day. His first name was Doug. I remember talking to him like the first week of school, and all of a sudden it occurred to me, this is the first time I've ever spoken to a black person. Now, how crazy is that? Absolutely crazy is that? That you're living in America, and and something like that occurs.
Thank you for that. I want to ask all of you, and whoever speaks up first. Was there a time when you were called into some common area so that a school administrator could talk to you about, we're about to start integration, there's going to be some changes in the school, you're going to be bused or students will be bused in? Did any of you have that kind of experience?
I did. I remember the principal's name was Mr. George. We're packed into this auditorium, and he says, okay, I want everybody to know that because of a United States Supreme Court case that came down several years ago, integration is coming to our school system in Hillsborough County. And Chamberlain's going to be integrated in 2 or 3 years. In 2 or 3 years. And there was a reaction amongst the students. But that's as close to anyone trying to explain any of this to any of us that I came to in all of the years ramping up to integration. And it was still several years off before Chamberlain integrated.
And Mr. Lawrence, for you, it's 1969. You're a junior in high school.
hmm
Schools still, for the most part, are not integrated. You still have a solid core of schools that are still all black.
All
Did
black.
you get the talking to from school administrators about here's what's going to happen?
No, I don't recall that. Not at all. I just know that one day they told us that Bentham was going to be closing, and the following year we were going to be going to Manatee. We were not prepped for it. It was just basically all of a sudden you're going to be going, and that was it. There was no discussion about it.
Commissioner Shaw, did
Yes,
you
ma'am.
have any conversation? Was there any talking to at Booker High School for the years you were there about we're about to be integrated and here's what's going to happen?
No, we didn't have the conversation because Booker was still yet away from it several years before Booker saw the integration come. Like I said, the first two students from Booker were out of the class of '65 to go to Sarasota High, and they were transferred out in the day and brought back in the day.
Judge Adams talked about his experience. He was in college before he had a conversation with a Black person, just having a conversation. What about you in terms of when you started interacting with others who were not of brown skin?
No, I didn't see it the same way. There was interaction at that point in time with people of non-color with us, so I didn't see the same interaction. We were. I can remember my sister being born in '58, and my mother's. Employer, Nancy Boot, coming out and she came in and looked and she says, "Oh, this is the prettiest little pickaninny I've ever seen." And my dad went, "Whoa." It was just like, and it took everything to hold my. Miss Boot was from Germany, and her experience was different, but that those were the things that we dealt with. I had experienced challenges along the way. What is now Fruitville Road was 3rd Street back in the day, and I've seen instances take place there because we had colored and white drinking fountains at the railroad station.
Were you aware of any families being concerned about having to send their students to predominantly white schools?
The two students from my class, there had to have been conversation because they both came from what was Overtown at that time. Both lived on 6th Street and 9th Street. And so the area from whence the integration would come was already, the lines were being drawn as to where they would come from.
Let's talk a little bit about the school experience and being able to go to predominantly white schools when that time came. And so I'm going to ask you, Mr. Lawrence, since you did have the opportunity to switch from going from being in an all-Black school to being bused to a predominantly white school, was there any harassment when you showed up or any things that you had to deal with? And I can tell you, even in the late 70s, I know at Riverview High School in Sarasota, you could be readily met at the bus stop with all kinds of students with their Confederate flags and guns, gun racks in the back of their pickup trucks. It wasn't a very welcoming experience. Did you have any of that kind of harassment when you were in 1970 in high school?
Well, we had a few things that we had to deal with. There were some pretty nasty issues that transpired, even with some of the teachers. But overall, we dealt with it. I cracked a couple of heads, but I didn't make a habit of it.
Let me talk a little bit about the migrant seasonal farm worker life. You mentioned that you were a migrant seasonal farm worker. And for many Black families, that meant at a period of time during the year, you would get on a bus or whatever transportation you were using, and you would go up what my family used to call on the season,
On the
whether it
season.
would be apple season, which was a very common when people would load the bus or get in their cars and travel up to New York, often upstate New York, to pick apples. And so the students did have to come out of school and attend school in a different location. Talk to us about when you were on the season, when you were going up to pick apples or whatever the vegetable or fruit was, did you think about your future and what you might be when you finish school?
No, I did start thinking about that in sixth, seventh grade, and my ambition actually was to go to law school. I had no thoughts of playing in the NFL because I never watched NFL games. Saturdays, Sundays, I was working. Even down here in the 50s and 60s, I worked in the celery fields down in Sarasota. Celery was big time back then. So I wanted to be a lawyer. I know that lawyers represented people. They sometimes champion for those that are unable to champion for themselves.
Judge Adams, if I could ask you, when you went to high school and you started thinking about the future and potential careers, did you feel as though the world was your oyster? You could be anything that you wanted?
No, but unlike Henry, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a football player, and I became a lawyer and a judge. So it all worked out, Henry.
All
No.
right. Commissioner,
Yes, sir.
you went to a predominantly Black high school. Did you have any thoughts ever in your mind that one day, coming out of Sarasota, Florida, an integrated neighborhood, that Newtown neighborhood, coming out of an integrated school, that you'd ever be be a commissioner? What were your thoughts when you were in school about career paths?
George Washington Carver had been big on me from fourth grade up in science, and I was very much thinking of becoming a scientist until I started washing dishes in Sarasota Memorial Hospital, and it changed my mind that wasn't going to be the way I was going to get there. When I got out of high school, I went to Gibbs Junior College. I traveled by bus. Manatee County sent a bus to Sarasota to take us to the Black junior college at that point. And there my mind changed again. And I too wanted to be the attorney, thinking that law would have been a way out and a way. But at that very same time, we had the Vietnam War. But instead, I went to the military. And from there, came back and went back to school. Went to school while in the military. I was blessed, God blessed me, to be in the Air Force.
Thank you for that. I want to ask you all one last question here. And the last question I have, and I'm going to start with Judge Adams. The N word. How often did you hear that when you were in school?
All the time. Not just in school, everywhere, in backyards, games we would play that used the N-word, games that we would play on elementary school, elementary school playgrounds. Heard it all the time. It was part of the common parlance back in those days.
Are you aware of students calling or using the N word? Just, I know you talked about
Sure.
playing in the yard,
Sure.
just amongst yourselves.
This is the early 60s, the late 50s, early 60s. Yes. And I will tell you this, that and partly because of that experience, because words have power. Words create behavior and action, and it just has to stop by people saying, no, that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable.
Thank you for that. I want to ask Commissioner Shaw. The court said in the case that we're talking about, Brown versus Board of Education, they talk about the fact of having children go to segregated schools. For children of African descent, it can cause feelings of insecurity, being less than. How often did you hear the N word when you were in school, and how did it make you feel as a child?
I can't, school, it wasn't used on campus. We didn't call each other or nothing, so we didn't see it. Um, my dad drove truck, so a lumber truck, and there were times that I saw it. And when I mentioned earlier the Third Street incident at the Fruitville Road today, and just beyond Fourth, there's a little church. One Sunday, my dad would take us out riding, and there was some young people riding on the hood, on the fenders of a convertible, and they were riding alongside of us, and they used it, and my dad stopped the car and stopped them, and it wasn't pleasant. I must have been 11, 12 years old, but it's challenged. It was challenged then. I say that because of who my father was. I can remember once, and in Sarasota Memorial Hospital, an individual having fallen, broken, a telephone pole broke, and was with his back broken, who wanted me to sing Old Black Joe and dance. And that was probably one of the most harrowing experiences I had with the N word and that as an individual growing up. For me personally, that stood out.
Were you a student then?
I was, and that was
How old were you? What grade were you in?
17. I was in Booker's 12th grade. I had worked the first year in the kitchen and had been blessed to work in the nursing aid in the evening at Memorial, and that one came up. Here was a person broken up. I'm helping. I'm taking care of him. He wants me in a ward to dance and sing Old Black Joe. First, I didn't know who Old Black Joe was, but it didn't sit very well with me.
Thank you, Commissioner, for sharing that very personal story. Mr. Lawrence, you're in high school, or even before then, your experience, if any, having been called the N word as a child.
It did happen. Uh, it wasn't repeated, but it did happen. And you know, growing up, and you see the comedy and stuff, and guys among themselves, and they use words, you know, and even in comedy, you see Richard Pryor and you see the other, and they can do that. But then when you let's say a white comedian gets up and he starts using that word, and he'd probably end up getting his ass kicked.
Twice.
But I've endured it, and it's happened. It happened quite a bit. Matter of fact, I had a teacher that that disrespected me in that manner, and we had a serious confrontation. But it was at Lincoln. Now he was mixed, and he wanted to beat us, and we all ever compared our stuff. It was bad, and we knew it was right. And
Now, when you said beat us, what do you mean?
with the paddle, so I'm in the front, and all the other kids got behind me, and so theirs were right, and so he wanted to beat me. I said, well, my work was right. He said, no, it wasn't. I said, well, yes, I'm saying I was very respectful. I've always been respectful. I said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't accept, you know, that. I said, because my work is right. And he was going to make an example out of me. So he took me to the dean's office and told him he wanted him to beat me. So I'm in the dean's office. They know I never got in trouble. And he told him what happened. So I told him. I said, you know, my work is right. It took the word Coach Clemens He went over. He was in math. And so the next day I go to class, he says, "Are you ready?" I was sitting in the back, and I said, "Well, ready for what?" He says, "Don't sit back there like a big black bear, you know." And I said, well, I don't say what I told him, but I said, well, further I'm concerned, I said, "You look like a," and he started coming behind me. You know, the kids were up, up. And so I stood up. I didn't know what I was going to do. He was probably about 150 pounds. I was about 210, 15 pounds. And he looked at me, and he was doing his hand like he was going to do karate. And I think he thought about it. And I never disrespected him, though. I just told him I can't accept that. And so he made me get out again. And he told them they wanted me to beat me. So I told Mr. Sanders, told him what happened. I said, "I'm sorry, but I can't accept. I would have done anything. I was not going to accept the whooping because I know I was right. I was not wrong." Sent me to the counselor, and they went over my papers. So I went the next day. They said, "Look, when you go back to class, just go and sit in and say nothing." So I went in and said nothing. We never had another word. Never had another word. And I think that I saved a lot of kids from getting their butt whooped. But yes, I've encountered folks with the N-word. And even today, sometimes, I have. I had a guy coming like he's my best buddy. And I was sitting at the bar, and he said, "Yeah, something nice on, son." And I looked at him, and I said, "You don't know me like that." And I wasn't trying to be no bad guy, but he was disrespecting me. And I straightened him. But yes, I've encountered that.
Could I ask you to just have the last comment here since you have talked about this? Can you just give us a last comment about how a young person, how a student could easily feel, as the court said, to feel inferior based upon their experience in school?
You know, personally, I think that feeling inferior or superior, I think all of those things start at home. I think it starts with your parents, your uncles, aunties, cousins, and it all of those things. Even as a migrant farm worker, we always were made to feel that we can do anything. You know, I pick tomatoes or taters. I can beat anybody. Didn't always do it, but I think that it starts at home. You know, kids are bred to do certain things. You know, kids come to school, they think, well, blacks is you in. Well, kids at other times, that you see or whatever, but it starts at home. And I think that if a parent does that with their kid and promote them in that manner and teach them the discipline and the respect for themselves and for others, and that they can do it, never that they can't. And I think that it starts at home. My mom, my dad, my stepdad, my grandma, everybody said, "Well, you know, I didn't go but 5th grade, but you're gonna go further." And it was not tolerated to quit. So it starts at home. And I think that if it's fed to them at home and they perpetuate it, that they can do anything. I have 3 kids that have MBAs. One's a mechanical engineer. And it ain't my fault, but I just help, you know, mentally it starts at home. And you can do anything. It does not matter. I didn't know I could play football so good. You know, I ran downfield and hit a guy 20 yards down the field. And the guys said, "Hey, go Killer." And the pro scout was, they said, "Well, who is that?" And they said, "That's Killer." I said, "Well, who in the hell is Killer?" You know, but then they started watching me. And that's what I did. You know, I did it. It starts at home.
We want to thank you all for joining us today. This session on Brown versus Board of Education and how local residents between Hillsborough County, Sarasota County, Manatee County experienced the days of segregation and integration following the Brown decision is what we've talked about today. What we have learned, or certainly what I have learned, is that no matter what side of the fence you're on, education is important to all of us.